Hello, my name's Colleen Getty, and I'm with The Room to Write, and you're watching the Journey of a Story series. Today we're welcoming illustrator writer Dirk Tiede. Welcome, Dirk.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for coming. And so we're going to sort of start out just paint a picture of you in your studio or your corner of the room, wherever that might be. And so kind of just tell us how a real writer, illustrator writes and illustrates.
Well, so I kind of have two workplaces. I have a studio in my house. It's a bedroom set aside where I actually have a drawing table and I have my computer set up and all my equipment and drawing supplies and whatnot. And that's where I do my drawing. So when I'm working on the comics, that's where I'm doing it. Or if I'm working on a painting or an illustration or something, that's where I work. But if I'm writing, I write on the couch. And with my laptop, I just have a little corner. My wife calls it my nest. Kind of gets filled up with papers and things. And I tend to write there. I also write sometimes at the coffee shop. But yeah, just work out of my house.
Okay. And so do you always write on a laptop, or do you ever
I go back and
handwrite?
forth.
Yeah.
I'll take a lot of notes by hand on notebook paper, when I'm first jotting down ideas. I also do like journaling and stuff, so I'll do that on paper and then I'll transcribe it. But once I'm actually writing scripts, I pretty much just do that on a laptop.
Okay. And so when you journaling is something I just want to pull out of that.
Yeah, sure.
Because I think a lot of times people think, oh, journals are just sort of you're writing down, dear diary, I went to the store today. But maybe talk a little bit about how journaling and what journaling is and how that helps.
Yeah, it's kind of just a brain dump. It's like whatever am I thinking about or feeling about on a particular day, and especially if I'm like really stirred up about something, I'll just sort of like write down my thoughts. It's not that dissimilar from when I'm writing for like a story. I'm just sort of like examining the contents of my brain, just sort of like looking at what's in there, and just it kind of comes out. Not exactly hearing voices, but it's it's a much less clinical version of that.
Keeping yourself from hearing voices.
Kind of, yes, exactly. It helps keep me sane. But also if I'm thinking about a project or if I'm like kind of ruminating about, like I'm working on marketing stuff right now, so I'm like writing down some thoughts about that or whatever happens to me in my head in the morning. Or if I just have something bustling around in my brain, or if I have a cool dream or something.
Right.
But it's not really like, dear diary, today I did this. I mean, sometimes it might start. I mean, it started out. I started doing it 7 years ago or something, and I just sort of would try to sit down every morning and like basically fill a page, 10, 15 minutes, and just see what came out of my head. And it's turned. I don't do it every day, but I try to do it, and it does kind of keep the mental gears limber.
Right, and so it almost sounds like it serves two purposes. One is sort of the writing, clearing of the throat, almost getting whatever junk on, maybe something that's intruding your creative process off of your mind, and then also maybe serving as a resource for ideas that might just show up there.
Absolutely.
All right.
And I kind of view it as much as like a health practice as a writing practice.
Yeah. So I'm a big journal advocate. So you've journaled, you've done a few ideas, and then do you take that to your computer, and then what do you do first? Now you're the first illustrator writer we've talked to. So do you write? Do you illustrate first?
It pretty much, well, the process kind of can go back and forth. Usually it always starts with an idea. And so for a story or a character or something, I'll have something beam in.
How does it beam in?
It just kind of appears as an image in my mind's eye, and I could just be driving down the street, on my way somewhere, or walking, or in the shower, or working out, or something, and an idea will come.
Okay.
And then I'll end up sort of building, accumulating ideas, and that's the sort of thing I'll turn into a story, and then I'll either write, like for Paradigm Shift, for instance, my graphic novel series, it started out, it really goes back to like high school days, but when its current form, I started writing it out as notes while I was taking the train into work every day. Okay. And so I had these ideas for some scenes, and I just kind of wrote them up in kind of like quick note form in a notebook. and
Okay.
that ended up serving as the basis for an outline.
So you took those notes and then you did a written outline, or do you do storyboarding, or how's that
Yeah,
work?
from that point, I started like drawing characters and sketches and trying to figure out, well, what do these characters look like?
Right.
And I also, since at the time I was living in Chicago, and the reason I started writing it down was I was getting inspired by some of the places in town. I was actually like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if there was a scene here? And so I also went and like took pictures around the area and like started to draw some sketches while I was still working on the outline. And then I wrote the first book of this, actually, I actually started drawing it first in a couple of pages, but for the rest of it, actually, once I got a couple of pages in, I started writing a script. And from that point on, I pretty much have always written scripts first, and then I'll start doing the artwork. And I work in sort of a process where I don't just immediately draw the finished thing. I'll do thumbnails, which are really kind of rough, quick versions, and then I'll do a rough drawing over that, and then you do as a finished drawing, and then you do the inks, and then everything else. So, and that becomes like the illustration process. But that initial writing, what we're talking about here, script. My process now is definitely get a script ironed out.
And is a script like a movie script where you're having a character's name and, that sort of a script?
Yes, it very much looks like I've basically taken a lot from movie scripts. And I kind of think, the stories kind of beam into my head like movies in my head. I always kind of joke, it's like I have this TV channel in my brain, and when everything's right, I'm sort of tuning into that and just watching and listening to what my characters are doing, and all I'm doing is transcribing. But, that's sort of combined with working from an outline and other stuff too. But I know that the reason I do this in the first place is that those stories kind of beam in, and I just want to get them out.
Right.
So I do always kind of think of it more like a film.
And so when you're writing it, are you writing in dialogue? Are you writing it just like a script, or do you get the dialogue down and then go back and put the setting around it, or how does that
it's
work?
back and forth. So if you were to look at my scripts, the format is very similar to a movie script, but it's very like, here's what happens, like, keep it in, and then sort of like a sentence, maybe two if there needs to be some sort of description. And then the carriage returns, they get a blank, and then if there's dialogue, then it's character, colon, dialogue. And then I kind of imagine each of those, anything that's broken by a return is sort of a panel in the story. And then at the top of each page, I put the page number. So that's the main difference from a movie script. A movie script would just be like, here's the scene, and then next scene, whatever.
Right.
Whereas I break it up into pages. I think about like what's going to be on this page.
Okay.
But I write it out. I don't write like panel one. I just write what happens, and then.
And is that your process, or is that like a regular process
That's
people use for
mine.
comic books?
Yeah, comics, there's no set format for scripts. I worked with a friend on another comic, Stranger, and he wrote the script for it, and it had some similarity as to how I do it, but he was very particular about panel one, page one, and then he would even write little notes about sort of the shape. He was thinking of what shape the panel would appear on the page, like if it was long and thin, or a big, big panel that took up most of the page or something. He was very specific, and I'm not. I'm just focusing on what are the characters saying, what are they doing, what's happening on this page.
Right.
And then I just move on and write as many as I need for that scene, or however many it feels right.
And when you say panel, do you mean like those individual boxes?
That's the individual drawing on each page. So like, yeah, that's a panel. So if open up a classic Marvel superhero like from the 60s, there'd be like 6 drawings per page, and each of those would be a panel, and they'd be in a particular like straight grid structure. But I don't do that very often. My panels are all sorts of different sizes and shapes.
And so, speaking of jargon,
yeah,
you got some. You can maybe tell me a little bit more about different types of jargon that are particular to writer, illustrator, comic books. what's the difference between a comic book, a graphic novel, manga, or whatever other things are flying around in there. Maybe you can give us a quick little tutorial.
So comic books are any form of visual storytelling where you're doing images and pictures together, and it's bound together in a book as opposed to a strip, like a newspaper comic strip. And it's bound together in a book. And the classic comic book is a floppy, we call floppies, but an issue, which it's like 20, 25 pages, and it's printed on paper and folded and then stapled together. This is your classic comic book. And then a graphic novel, the only difference is basically length. It's just a book-length comic or a novel-length comic. So, once you start getting past 50 pages, 100 pages, 200 pages, that's definitely a graphic novel. Even if it's a collection of issues or, part of a continuing series or something, it's still a graphic novel because of the format. It's just the length. And then manga in particular is Japanese comics. That's just the Japanese word for comics. And so it has a particular look associated with it, and my work happens to be very influenced by manga, kind of the large eyes and expressive faces, but then like hyper detailed like backgrounds and things, but it can vary up. A lot of manga tends to be aimed at teens. It's sort of a YA sort of young adult sort of focus. I didn't particularly think of that when I wrote this, but I was sort of writing it for my 14-year-old self, so I guess it sort of counts.
And that is your genre, right?
I sort of plug myself into sort of the YA space, sort of what I kind of think of my work as now, especially. I didn't think of it that way when I first started, but I think that's kind of where it fits these days. But yeah, it's sort of that. So if you were to look at my artwork, someone say, "Oh, it's kind of manga style." Well, that means I just was influenced by a lot of Japanese artists.
Okay, and is that all the jargon in your realm that
people
might
that
not know?
For that sort of stuff, definitely. I mean,
and when you get into jargon, but taking away from that, these days with technology and things, I know that you had mentioned you were doing some research on sort of technology and what the influence is on culture these days, and now graphic novel is definitely become much more popular than it's ever been, and I don't know if you want to kind of talk about that sort of space.
I mean, I have an interest in that in part because my background was in internet stuff. So when I was taking the train into work every day and writing the first snippets of what would become Paradigm Shift, I was doing a web design job. So I was working for an internet company, and then when I first started to work on Paradigm Shift and drawing it, I decided to make a website for it, and it was actually 20 years ago, like this month, that I launched that website, which is kind of ridiculous.
Happy
But so I've sort of I ended up putting on the site, and then I ended up getting involved with webcomics, which were just putting comics online. Anybody who put comics online, then they had a webcomic. And that's how I sort of got my start in the comics business. And so because of that, I've paid attention to sort of the trends that have happened over the years, because I was in the thick of it, especially for a long time. But about 8 years ago, 9 years ago was when like social media really started taking off, and a lot of the web that I was familiar with started changing, and it started feeling very different, and sort of the character of what I was used to changed.
Different in a good way or in a bad way, or how do you mean?
I found myself more and more uncomfortable in a lot of those spaces. But at the same time, I was still like in it. And then in 2012, I sort of took a break. 2012, 2013, I put the comic on pause. I had 3 books out. I was working on another one, but it wasn't really gelling for me. So I took a break. And then in the intervening years, I was sort of noticing all this stuff that was happening online. And there was like this Twitter shaming, and there was like this thing called Gamergate, where they, like, kids who, and teenagers just and young adults who were into video games were suddenly attacking like video game journalists who were women, and it was like, what is going on with this stuff? And this was on top of the fact that I had felt kind of uncomfortable in these spaces, and I was like, what is going on with this? But at the same time, there was some cool stuff that was happening. There was like the Occupy movement that had been assembled online, and there was Anonymous, which was a group of hackers who were using their skills for political purposes, like especially for like progressive causes, and they ended up helping the people in the Arab Spring who were uprising up against their governments, and like so there was this group of hackers that was like helping them out to like defy their governments, and there was like all this fascinating stuff. So it was like at the same time I was seeing.
So you started art there, and now you're first social media was helping to promote your art, and now
then I was seeing like, oh my God, it kind of exploded. It moved beyond just comics, and so that ended up being inspiration for a new story, and a story that I finished the script for last year, and now I'm shopping around. That's a science fiction story that got really, really influenced by a lot of these things I was researching. And so now I kind of keep an eye on these trends and follow authors who are writing about it. And I even teach a media literacy class, and partly because I've been doing this kind of research. So
and through your writing, you're wanting to connect with your readers. And in order to be able to do that, if it's a young population, you need to educate yourself on sort of the troubles and the excitements that they're dealing with online.
Exactly. And even then, like now I'm working on like revamping my social media presence and trying to like become more familiar and comfortable in that space again. So even though it sort of changed on me, and you know, as anyone who gets older, stuff changes, and then you're like, this is unfamiliar. I got to figure out what to do with this. But instead of running away, I'm just kind of doing research and then now acting upon it. So
Okay. So your ideas come in. You sort of organize them almost like a movie. And then how do you what's the process between when you get your ideas down and then you're polishing them up? Do you have a critique group, or do you have particular resources or influences that help shape how it ends up, or what happens between that point?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've always had friends who look at things for me. Back first 3 books, I had a friend who played editor for me, so I'd always be sending her my scripts ahead of time, and she'd look over them and give me feedback on them. And now I'm a part of a critique group who kind of do that like as a group, and then I also have a couple friends who I lean on to kind of show. So my scripts now will go through a couple of editing rounds before I kind of feel they're ready to start drawing. So yeah, it's like try to do like 2 drafts if I can, but yeah, I definitely have people look at them and have some trusted co-creator types who I trust their judgment, and they can kind of like just go, hey, that you might want to work on that, or this is awesome, you really should just run with that.
And so now you have 2 different mediums you're using. So then how does that work in terms of you might have writers critiquing the writing, and then what about the artwork? And do you usually stick with whatever the artwork is and change the writing, or do you have to do both?
So I try to like hammer out as much of the story issues as I can in the writing first, if I can. And then from there, then I go and do sort of a thumbnailing round. So I'll do very quick drawings, and then that sort of lets me see what I've written visually. And then I can see, oh, this part isn't working as well as I thought it might, and then I can have a chance to play around with it before I've spent much invested a lot of time in it. And then once I've done that, at that point, it's like I've gone through the story a few times, so it's had a few chances to be revised, and then I'm a lot more ready to like just go ahead and just knock out the rest of the artwork.
And have you done any writing without accompanying illustration, or do you always do both together?
Not for stories, really. I mean, I did some when I was young, like before, like in high school, college, a bit, but some of which was like for class and whatnot. But I did try this current science fiction graphic novel. It started out me thinking I might try writing it as a prose novel, maybe doing with illustrations, but and when I first joined my critique group, I was bringing in like chapters of that, and I was realizing that like, oh man, like I feel like I know a lot about story and character and whatnot, but prose is a very different craft than comics. So even though I could think very visually, I didn't have a lot of the tools in my tool belt to make it for like good reading necessarily. I mean, the pacing might be good or the dialogue might be good, but you know, the idea, like something that works in a movie, like, you know, you get the big dramatic shot of the spaceship as it flies past you, like, from the, you know, I'd have like, the way it would come out in prose would be this big info dump about like all the little things, and then, you know, I'd bring it to my critique group and I'd get back a comment like, who's seeing this? And I'm like, does it matter? Can't it be omniscient? But I mean, so it was things like that I wasn't thinking of. So eventually I just went back to writing comics.
And so speaking of omniscient, what is the point? Is there a sort of a trademark point of view for graphic novels, or
I think of it like a movie. So, I mean, I do tend to follow particular characters. So, but there are times when you need to cut away. So, I mean, if you're watching a TV show, I mean, like a classic X-Files episode, for instance, it would almost always start with like the monster or whatever and whoever the victim was. And I totally borrowed that, you know. And then, you know, that character would get killed. But, I mean, that's how, you know, no spoilers. I mean, that's how Game of Thrones starts, too. So, you know, you have a point of view character who just, you know, who's only there for the one chapter. But I'm not limited by chapters. So I think in scenes instead of chapters. And I can change, you know, I'm, like for Paradigm Shift in particular, I made a very distinct decision from the beginning to not go inside the characters' heads. So there's no thought balloons. There's just dialogue. There's just sound effects. There's just what you see. It's like a movie that way. There's no narration boxes, no captions, nothing like that. So, you know, you just see what the characters hear and see. So that was a distinct point of view decision. With comics, I mean, you can get in characters' heads with thought balloons and captions and things. So, you know, it's not that dissimilar from prose that way. But like a movie, you can point the camera anywhere. And what happens from panel to panel, you can either follow the same subject, you can move the camera and point it completely differently, you could have the camera travel thousands of miles between panels if you want. You know, here's a shot, you know, downtown Boston, and the next shot is on the moon. You know, I mean, and depending on what your story you're trying to tell, you can do that in comics, and you might even be able to go back and forth and juxtapose. There's a particular scene in a comic I loved as in high school. I'll still pull it out from time to time. It was a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles issue, and I loved it because the top 4/5 of the page was Leonardo, you know, the turtle with the swords, running through the snow, trying to avoid all these ninjas and fighting them, and just trying to like survive in the streets of New York on a snowy winter, you know, evening. And then on the bottom panel, like just stretched across the whole page at the bottom, it would cut back to the other turtles and their friend April getting ready for Christmas. They were like hauling in the tree on one panel and, you know, decorating it, and somebody's cooking dinner, Christmas dinner, and like every page it's like this cut back to this parallel thing that's happening. And that would be something that would be really hard to pull off in prose. But you can do it visually in comics.
And so that's making me, I mean, knowing that graphic novels, I mean, I have 4 kids and they like to read everything, but they also like to read graphic novels, not necessarily like the comics, but, you know, a lot of books these days.
Yeah, totally.
But is that the draw these days, is because it is like a movie, and because so many kids are tuned into videos and watching movies and watching television and shows that they almost don't have the patience for prose spelling it out for them, but like you're outlining that you can be here, you can be on the moon, and then you can be on the ground. I wonder if that's the draw.
I think there is something to that. I mean, we are as a culture becoming more and more visual, now that the mediums have become easier for people to create visual stuff, but that means that's all the more reason to be media and visually literate, to know what images you're choosing and what are you looking at and whatnot. So I can definitely see that might be a reason why comics are now becoming more popular and more widely read. I like to think that they're kind of a gateway drug to books in general, so that, I mean, I love drawing comics, but I only read some comics. I mostly read prose. You know, I read nonfiction, I read novels. I'm influenced very much by these things. And but I'm very choosy about what graphic novels and comics I read. So I have particular things that I'm into. It's been a long time since I've had the monthly subscription at the local comic shop for a particular Marvel book, for instance. I haven't done that since I was in high school.
Well, and that always gets back to every writer I've talked to talks about, you don't just write, without reading first. And so even, you're writing graphic novels, and yet you're consuming a lot more words necessarily than you're outputting, but you needed to consume those words in order to create your own.
Yeah, one of my favorite authors, William Gibson, was a cyberpunk sci-fi author. He always talked about how you just got to put things in the hopper, and then you never know what's gonna come out on the other end.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So I get as many ideas from novels as I do from movies, from comics. I've kind of figured out what works for me in comics, and I'll still look for inspiration from our other artists. But story-wise, I get my ideas everywhere. And when I talk about like getting ideas from like a novel or a movie, they're often like sort of more of the technical craft ideas. Like, oh, that was a particularly clever narrative device. I wonder how I could, something like that might work for this scene. Or something like that.
Speaking of inspiration, we're unfortunately towards the end here, but I'd like to offer you an opportunity to maybe talk a little bit for a closing remark on inspiring the audience of writers or writers in general, and maybe with some advice you can leave them with or inspiration.
Well, for me, what has always worked is that ultimately it's always been about the joy of being able to like just sit down and like be with those characters in my mind. It's like that. It's daydreaming time essentially. And so over the years, the important bit was to carve out that little bit of time. It started with me like taking notes on the train. I had twice a day, for an hour each way on the train to write out those notes, and that ended up helping me start into a story. And then I took time after work to work on that. I was in my 20s, so I didn't have a lot of other responsibilities then, so it was a good time to get started. But even then, I wouldn't be able to produce all this work if I hadn't just taken time to carve out that little bit. And it's time for me. It's my time. I get to just be with my characters. I get to be with my stories. I get to be with my art. I get to do that. And it was playtime. Like, it's always playtime. That's when it feels the best. And so if you've got a big idea, you take it from that idea to a finished thing. It's really just about carving out that little time. And even if you've got, if you want to make it full time one day, it just starts out by like carving that little bit out, even if you got the full-time job or you got a part-time job.
And I think that's probably the most important thing
that
every writer needs to do.
Absolutely. And even now, I still work as a freelancer and do illustration gigs, and I teach part-time, and then the rest of the time is mine. So I can work on that. But it took 20 years. So
But you carved it out.
Exactly. But it started by just writing those notes on the train.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Dirk. Thanks for coming in and sharing all your inspiration and all your knowledge about the writing process. And if anybody would like to join us in the Room to Write chair, go to the roomtowrite.org and send an email if you'd like to be part of the show.